All right, so it is filling up. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another LearnDash webinar. I'm probably going to give it 2 minutes or so, maybe at 1:17, we'll get started and do some quick introductions. If you would like, go ahead and put where you're joining us from in the chat. We love to see where everyone is. So I'll start. I am in Atlanta, Georgia, in the USA. And yeah, let's see where everyone is. We have someone from LA. Is that Los Angeles or is that Louisiana? I always get confused on that one. I got some Canada people here, Birmingham, Alabama, Boston, Thailand, Germany. Nice. So what time is it your way, Vic?
It's midnight
Oh,
15.
wow. I'm sorry. If I would have known that, I probably would have did the time a little bit differently. So I apologize.
No, it's all good. It's all good.
Do you normally kind of work kind of off hours in your time zone since everyone's everywhere all over? So
Yeah, you just have to figure out like what you need to do and just do it and catch up on your sleep, whenever you can.
yeah, I kind of like the idea. It depends on the time zone and like when you wake up, everything's already done or vice versa. So that's pretty cool. And Adam commented that he is in the city of Los Angeles, but he's lived in Louisiana as well. So that's pretty cool. All right, I'll give it 1 more minute before we get started. I will do some quick housekeeping things. So the chat should be open for everyone. I see everyone's replying in there, so that works fine. And then there's a Q&A box. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to put your question in there. Someone from the team will get back to you in the Q&A box. If you put a question in chat, I do recommend putting it in Q&A because sometimes we will not see it, especially if the chat is going really fast. So that is that. There will be a replay going out tomorrow, so this is being recorded. I'll probably say it a few times throughout because we get that question quite often throughout the webinars. Is it being recorded? Yes, it is. All right, so it is 1:17. I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Carmen Kendrick. I'm the product marketing manager here at LearnDash. I also have Addison, who's our customer success manager. She's here. She's just not on video, but she'll be answering your questions in the chat about LearnDash. And then we have the MemberFix team, and I'll let them introduce themselves in any order that you all want.
Hey guys, I'm Vic Dorfman. I'm the founder of MemberFix, and we're a digital agency that works with WordPress membership sites and definitely a lot with LearnDash, and the co-founder of MemberHost. And these are my co-founders from MemberHost as well.
All right, Robert. So Danny, did you want to do like your own type of introduction, or are you all good with just your names up and your nice faces?
Oh, well, Vic's got something in the presentation to kind of tell a little bit how we are. So
Okay,
we'll let him work his magic when he gets to that point.
All right, awesome. Well, I will let you all take it over from here then.
All right, guys, thank you so much for coming out. We are really excited to share some really good and useful, hopefully practical stuff with you for optimizing performance. And let me just get my screen share going real quick. Okay. Now, can you guys see my slides okay?
All good.
Okay. And you're not seeing the panel with my speaker notes, are you? Beautiful. Okay.
Oh, looks good here.
Okay, so as I said, I'm Vic Dorfman. I'm the founder of MemberFix, and we've been working with WordPress membership sites, e-learning sites, and so forth for over 10 years now. And I'm also the co-founder of MemberHost, which is our company that we're co-founders in, which is an ultra-performant hosting solution for these heavy dynamic WordPress sites like your LearnDash sites, Buddy, Boss, MemberPress, all of that good jazz, WooCommerce. And we will be presenting this webinar with our co-founders. And we're going to get into introductions, who we are, why you should listen to us shortly. And it looks like Carmen already pretty much took care of getting you guys warmed up. And so we can actually skip this part, but if you want to put into the chat your like your role in your business, are you the developer, lead dev? Are you the systems administrator? Are you the founder? and so forth, please let us know so that we can sort of tailor the presentation. You know, do we want to lean it a little bit more on a technical note, or do we want to keep it a little bit more high level? So please pop that in the chat and just let us know, you know, if you're the founder or agency owner or whatever the case may be. All right, give you guys a few seconds to do that. Hey, Michael, very cool to have you here. Got the founder of WP Engine here. Program manager of LearnDash. Instructional designer. Brian from Zlake. Hey, Brian, good to see you again. All right, lead dev for a site that uses LearnDash. Okay. Adam runs a web design studio called Data TV. Sweet. Okay. Let's get to it, guys. Why are we here? What are we here to learn? And real quick, just to give you, some expectations, we're going to try to keep this presentation portion to like 40 minutes, perhaps less, and then the Q&A portion to, 15, 20 minutes or thereabouts. And obviously, the title of the webinar is regarding optimizing your WordPress sites or heavy WordPress sites. We'll get into what that actually means. But because this is such a big topic, we decided that we want to approach it in kind of an 80-20 fashion, right? So in other words, what are the 20% of optimizations that you can do that will get you, 80% of the performance benefits? However you quantify or define performance, that's kind of a big question. So let's say, for example, if you spend 10 hours optimizing a site, and that 10 hours of work will improve performance by 80%, again, however you measure that, but you might spend another 10 or 20 hours trying to squeeze out, another 5 or 10% of performance improvement. Is that a good use of your time? Not really. You're getting into diminishing returns. So we want to focus on those low-hanging fruits, those things that are going to really move the needle. And kind of just to give you a quick overview of what we'll cover, we'll talk about how to choose the right hosting, things to look for on the hosting front. Obviously, that's a really important component here. Also, what is the difference between the different types of hosting? Your shared hosting, your VPS, managed cloud, and so forth. Then we're going to get into the actual meat and potatoes, the nitty-gritty, what you guys want to know, the techniques, the tips and tricks. We call those the low-hanging fruit WordPress level optimizations. We're going to talk about what I call the inconvenient truth about caching and its place in optimizing these dynamic type sites. And while we will tangentially touch on optimizing like the page speed, the first content full paint, some of these front end factors, that's not really the focus of this presentation. The focus is how can you scale and run your, your heavy dynamic site, your LearnDash site, your Buddy Boss, that whole, because it's usually they all come together, right? You're typically not running one in a vacuum. How can you scale and run that as new users come and as you have a lot of learners and people hitting the shopping cart, people interacting with the site and the database without slowing down, without throwing errors, and without crashing, right? In other words, how can you scale smoothly and elegantly? That's kind of the focus. So before we dive into that and before I hand over the mic, I want to really quickly introduce my co-founders. I already talked about myself. Denny Cave is going to be giving the presentation, and he's sort of our technical co-founder. He also runs an agency, but he also runs a, what would you call it, Denny? Like an infrastructure as a service company? What would you say Mighty Box is?
Yeah, geared specifically towards WordPress.
Right. So he's very deep into the performance and hosting side of WordPress. And Risto, as I said, he is kind of our sysadmin / technical sales guru. So that's all I have, guys. Let me just check the chat, make sure. Okay, we're just getting some nice questions in. Cool. So you guys ready? Let's dive in. All
Let's
right.
go.
Handing the mic over to Denny Cave.
All right. So before we get into the actual optimizations, it's kind of foundational stuff that I want to touch on. It sounds like from the chat that most of the folks here are leaning more towards the technical side. So I'll try and keep it light. But we do need to cover some of the bases here just to have a complete conversation of the topic at hand. So when we're looking at LearnDash, we really want to talk about what's different with LearnDash from a regular WordPress site or from a marketing site. We're going to be looking at the unique technical requirements that we need to consider with LearnDash, because those are going to inform our approach to all the optimization techniques that we deploy. The main thing that we run into with LearnDash is that it's what we call transactionally heavy. There are a ton of PHP files running behind the scenes. There are lots of action hooks and filters that are happening, linking into WordPress, but also other plugins linking into the things that LearnDash is doing. There are a lot of database reads and writes that are happening as users take actions throughout their course experience. So this is happening for almost every single page view that you generate. And this becomes a problem because we really can't do page caching. Most of the pages are dynamic. When we're talking about a marketing site, we can generate a version of the page. The server can store that, and we can show that to every single visitor that visits for the next however long. In LearnDash, everything's unique to each individual user. They're logged in, they're seeing their unique course content, their profile, all things of that nature. So we can't rely on that at all, essentially. Maybe in a few marketing pages that might be throughout your site, the page caching can help, but it's really not going to move the needle much inside of LearnDash. And this isn't unique to LearnDash. There's not a problem with LearnDash. This is for any kind of dynamic content plugin or membership system. And then these problems are kind of it's a pile-on effect, because you're usually not running LearnDash on its own. It's coming with a shopping cart through WooCommerce, or you're doing some type of billing module with your membership plugin, or you have BuddyBoss and you're running a community. And so this problem just snowballs as you add on these other plugins and these other pieces of heavy code bases. So optimizing performance that in a way that impacts not just LearnDash, but all of those plugins really becomes of utmost importance. When we are looking at the performance itself, we kind of, and the optimization techniques, we have to look at two sides of it, really. There's the server side tools and utilities and things that we install. Then there's the WordPress side that helps inform the server how it needs to use those tools. So again, if we're talking about some type of caching, and I'll use the page caching example because most people are familiar with that. We're generating this page, we're storing it, and that's happening now at the server level. But WordPress itself has to inform the server, hey, it's time to clear that page, or how long should I have kept it? Or I updated a plugin and now we need to clear the entire cache. So there's going to be some add-ons inside of WordPress that we need to look at as well. It's not all going to be on the server side. So specific things that we really need to look into that are going to strongly impact the overall performance of LearnDash and of all these other plugins that you'll have installed alongside of them. The first one being CPU performance. This tends to really be overlooked in a lot of hosting environments. It's kind of an afterthought. Most hosts don't mention it. And I say performance specifically because speed, when you're talking about raw gigahertz of a processor, doesn't really necessarily mean that a processor is of a better performance just because of the numbers are higher. Intel has a processor, for example, where their new generation runs at 3.2 gigahertz, the old one runs at 3.7, but all things considered, that newer generation processor outperforms. And the reason this becomes important is because of all that code that we have to churn through. And in general, again, this isn't an absolute, but in general, the faster the processor we can get to go through all of those instructions, the faster we're going to be able to display the content that is being generated in that request. You may be asking yourself, what about the number of processor cores? I know that some processors have 2 or 4 or 6, or we get massive processors in servers and in data centers, the number of cores just really grows. But for an individual page request, for an individual user experiencing your site, unless the site is completely overloaded with visitors at that point in time, the number of cores itself is not going to have any impact on the page speed and on the speed of the page generation and of the ultimate loading time that the user sees. However, the performance of that CPU, the speed of those single CPU cores is going to have a huge impact on those individual requests. So we really need to consider that when we're looking at hosting environments. We'll talk a little bit more on this later, but basically faster or more performant CPU is going to be faster front-end page loads for your visitors. It's going to be a faster admin experience for yourself as well. I know that becomes a bottleneck a lot of times in these larger sites where you just wait forever for pages to load in the admin side, and kind of becomes a painful experience. So very closely related to the CPU performance is PHP workers. And this is the case where we're talking about more along the lines of the number of cores that we have in our processors. PHP workers, if you're not familiar with them, are the functionality, the processes in your web server where we offload PHP requests to. So if you're loading an image or a CSS file, that's just static content that's going to come through your web server. If you're trying to load WP admin, that's going to go through a PHP worker. Your web server is going to send that request off to the worker, and then the worker is going to deliver the result back to the web server, which will get sent on to you. And these PHP workers go hand in hand with the number of cores that we have. And there's no exact science to how many PHP workers we would have for the number of cores. That's a larger discussion, a more technical thing that we would need to get into. But in general, the more processor cores you have, and the more PHP workers you're going to be able to support. And that means you're going to be able to have more visitors hitting your site at one time. And if you're not familiar with this concept, I like to think about it as like a checkout at the grocery store. And the speed with which a cashier can check you out is kind of like your processor performance. The number of lanes and the number of cashiers that we have is a good analogy for the number of PHP workers, or the number of CPU cores that we have. And so by increasing the number of cores and by increasing the number of PHP workers that are at each of those checkouts, we can take care of more people at one time before they have to start lining up behind each other. Beyond those technical pieces of the server, we're going to also look at our code base. I skipped that. I kind of talked about that a little bit. We can't just increase PHP workers in our software configuration without having the cores to support it. We also can't just increase the number of cores on our server and then not touch our PHP worker configuration. We have to bump both of those things up together in our configuration. Otherwise, we won't get any benefit from them. And one other thing I was going to say here was that I touched on this, but you're not going to see very many metrics. As you're looking at web hosts, you're not often going to see CPU metrics at all. You may see PHP workers. That's becoming a bigger thing that people are talking about. But it's not uncommon for that to be pretty hidden or not available at all. And most of the major managed web hosts are not going to give you specs on CPUs. I think part of it is that anybody's asking that information is probably going to be disappointed by the answer they get with regard to the speed of their CPUs that are being deployed. And the other piece of it is there is a little bit of variability as we deploy new machines and we upgrade servers and things like that. And it can present a little bit of a documentation hurdle, or maybe making false promises to people with regard to specific gigahertz and things like that if we were to document that and give that out to people. So I see some reason for not mentioning it, but really the only way you can find out what type of CPU you're running is to ask the host in most cases. They're not usually going to publish this. All right, sorry, now just the part I was skipping ahead to. The code base is another massive piece of performance here. And I'm going to refer to, usually throughout the rest of this to your application, because we're running a website, but at the end of the day, there's so much going on here. We're essentially building a custom SaaS app with LearnDash and all the components that we plug in. And because we have so many of those plugins, we typically have a lot of code to process. And so when we're looking at the code base, anything we can do to reduce the amount of code that we're having to chew through is going to open up more room in the processor to take care of the things that we do have still inside of the site. So this is sometimes we can do something about it, sometimes we can't. We'll talk about those techniques in a bit, but it's definitely something to consider, as well as external API calls. Those are going to sometimes eat up time in the loading cycle of any particular page request. And it just depends on the plugin and what they're reaching out to and how they're architecting that. But there are a lot of ways you can asynchronously call those things so that they don't have to happen as you're waiting on the page to load. Distance is another thing that most people don't think about often. And this really, if you have a global audience, it's not a whole lot you can do about this for the most part. But if you have more of a hyperlocal audience, or let's say you're in Australia and you are only targeting other people in Australia, there's no reason for your server to be in New York and to have people have to hop all the way across an ocean to load your site. We should look for something more local that's going to give us a lot better latency. Reduce those latency numbers as we're looking at hopping all the way across to a distant place. And there's not always a lot you can do about this, but if and when, you should do it. The other thing to keep in mind here, and we'll talk about Cloudflare more in a little bit too, but we've seen cases where implementing Cloudflare in a hyperlocal situation or any kind of a CDN actually puts the assets and the points of presence out further from the visitors than the actual origin server would have been. So there can be these weird cases where you try and do something to improve performance and you're actually now moving your connections out further from your users than you intended.
And Denny, we've seen cases too, right? Like the distance thing is important, all things being equal, right? Because we've deployed servers for customers that are not local to their user base, but it still outperformed their local hosting provider that they were using because it was just grossly underpowered.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks for bringing that up. If we are doing significantly better in the performance area we can totally overcome those latencies that we see just by being on a further away server. So for sure. All right, caching. I said a few slides back, we don't do page caching. So you might be wondering why that's here. There are a couple of other types of caching that we can take advantage of. Sometimes your host will have these and they're already configured. Sometimes it won't, but these are things that we definitely need to be looking into and asking about. First one of those is OpCache. And this is basically we are loading PHP files into memory and storing the zeros and ones that get generated out of those in a way that they can be accessed very quickly again in the future. We don't have to reopen that file, reinterpret what it's supposed to be doing, and then execute it again. We can just go straight to executing the file. And this can have a pretty dramatic effect whenever we are inside of something like LearnDash or BuddyBoss, where we have just tons and tons of files that are being loaded with every request. Object cache helps with database query loading. So it'll do a similar thing, load up the database query. And if that doesn't change for a certain period of time, there's no reason to go back to the database and ask for it again. We can get it straight out of our RAM and greatly speed up lots of different types of requests, but specifically in the case of LearnDash, this is going to help a lot with WP admin, where you're loading a ton of information about the courses or about users, and you'll really see a big impact there. Page caching, just one last time, it's not really something that we're going to dig into today. It's not a technique I generally recommend, but it can have its place. If you have marketing pages on your site that you want to the homepage, for example, if it's not loading anything about the users, there can still be a benefit, but it's not a general technique that we would look at when we're talking about increasing performance. And I do also want to say, if you're using anything like a WP Rocket or Breeze or Cache Enabler, if you're using a plugin for your page caching, that's something you should look at pulling out and look at what are your options for server-side page caching. Because if you're using the plugin, all the requests still go through PHP, and it still has a big performance impact at scale when you have lots of concurrent users, and you can get a lot further with server-side page caching. All right, talking about hosting, again, just for a complete discussion, we kind of need to go over these things, but I'll try and make this brief because it sounds like everybody has a pretty good handle on these types of topics. And the lines these days are really blurred. It used to be, GoDaddy was all shared hosting, and other providers were all VPS or virtual machine hosting. Now all the providers have different types of different tiers of hosting that they're offering. So if it's not clear to you what type of hosting that is, you kind of have to reach out to the provider or reach out to one of us. We'll be happy to provide you an opinion on what you're looking at there. The main types starting out with, and this is where almost all of us started. I bet if we asked, everybody would have started here in shared hosting. It's where I started years and years ago. It's the cheapest, most cost-effective way usually to get up and running, but we can't really configure very many server customizations. A lot of times it's not fully optimized for WordPress. You're going to have artificial limits placed on resources like the PHP workers, or inodes is a weird one that you see with a couple of hosts. And they're usually deploying really large core, but very slow CPUs. So it just tends to be oversold. We've all heard about these types of things, kind of like overselling seats on an airplane. And if everybody shows up at once, we have a problem. If they don't, we might be okay. But really the takeaway for shared hosting is, in a LearnDash context, in my opinion, it's really only suitable for proof of concept. Anything serious as far as the number of users that you're deploying, you're gonna start to struggle pretty quickly to have that run well inside of a shared hosting environment. Next kind that we look at, and I think a number of you indicated that you were running on this, would be like a virtual machine of some kind or a virtual private server. There are technical differences between those two technologies, but for the purposes here, they're mostly the same. We're basically looking at taking a single physical server, and we're divvying that up into multiple smaller pieces. And this is going to give us probably usually a more expensive hosting environment, but it's also going to usually have better performance and much better isolation between other sites that are running on the server. In the shared hosting environment, you're generally always running a single web server, and so you can't make any tweaks or customizations to that outside of maybe an htaccess file or something like that. In this case, you usually have a ton of control over what's running, even root access to the virtual machine, and you can make any customizations you want. Downside is, in most cases, you also have to pair this with a control panel of some kind and have a little bit more technical expertise. GridPane, Run Cloud, or SpinUp WP might be types of things you would install, and you'd be putting those on top of DigitalOcean or Linode or Vultr, something of that nature. And I will say Cloudways kind of has best of both worlds here, where they have the control panel and they're launching on the dedicated virtual machines. But they're probably one of the biggest providers giving you that control panel piece. So this gives you a good mix of price and performance, but it's not really a good solution if you don't know for sure what you're doing. All right, dedicated servers are similar to the virtual machines, except you get control of the entire server. Sometimes there's depending on the provider, there may be additional layers of abstraction here, or you may get full-on root access to the server. But again, you're going to need a control panel in this case to layer on top of that and provide the experience of managing your WordPress sites. You're going to get good performance out of these, but you're definitely going to need some server admin experience. Most providers are just giving you the boxes and giving you the servers, and you're kind of on your own from there. And if they're plugged in and online, that's the extent of their responsibility. There are others that will do a more managed experience, but This wouldn't be for the faint of heart or for people that are just getting started, no matter how much you need that performance. You'd probably be frustrated if you're new to this. Cloud hosting isn't something that probably most of the time we don't split it out separately like this, but we look at it a little differently because maybe it's running on virtual machine or VPS type technologies to segment the individual installations and to provide some separation between sites. But where it starts to be considered cloud, in my opinion, is when we're talking about networking these things together and we're in environments where we're maybe having a database server running on one node and an application server running on another node, or we're running multiple application servers, multiple database servers, and we're really kind of building out more of a high availability, high traffic type system. Those kind of fall into this cloud area, and you're going to see this on like higher tiers of WP Engine or Kinsta, Pantheon, Pagely, and then like MemberHost. This is the type of deployments that we do on a daily basis. You're going to get great performance out of these. There's usually some scalability component involved where you can control costs a little bit if and when you need to. And then you get high availability a lot of times, which means you're just improving your uptime. You're reducing the points of failure throughout the system. The other big thing with hosting that you have to consider is, we talked about just the infrastructure, but you need to think about the level of support you get from your provider as well. So a couple of those options I mentioned, hey, you're on your own. You got to pair it with a control panel. You're going to need some server admin experience. So when you're thinking about where to either start your site or whether to grow it or where to grow it at, you need to think about the providers that are only going to give you infrastructure only, like AWS, Google Cloud, DigitalOcean. Those aren't probably going to be the best choice for a lot of folks if you're non-technical. Then you moved into this tier of like managed WordPress, where they're generally better configured for WordPress from the start. There's still some baseline configuration a lot of times that's a little bit dumbed down for all the sites, and you may not get control over granular changes yourself, but support is generally more well-versed in WordPress specific issues, and you're going to get basic assistance, at least with troubleshooting things, looking at error logs, problems with your firewall, helping make a configuration change here or there. These providers are usually going to have people that could give higher level tech support, but they're more focused on the economies of scale. So you're going to be responsible for a good chunk of it on your own still. And that again is what we're all familiar with, usually Kinsta, WP Engine, Rocket.net, Pantheon. That's what we do at MightyBox. It's more of like, hey, we'll help you with some of the basics, but you're kind of on your own to run your application on a day-to-day basis. And then the upper echelon, the upper tier of support is what we call premium managed support, where these people are giving application level support. So if you're having any kind of a problem, they're going to be able to dig in. A lot of times there's 24/7 access to somebody who knows WordPress inside and out. They're going to have domain specific knowledge, done for you fixes for just about anything you can come up with. And you're going to get a lot more proactive support too, with like uptime monitoring, security and virus scanning, things like that. And this is going to be more in the Pagely tier of things. MemberHost, this is stuff we do there as well. So on the hosting side, you kind of have to think about, as you're looking where to deploy, not just that infrastructure piece, but what do you need on the support side as well. All right. The part we've been waiting for. Hopefully at this point, we've chosen a good host, we've laid the foundation, and we are ready to move forward with really tweaking out our servers and our application for the best performance possible. The first step before we make any changes are to find out where are we at right now. There are a number of tools that we use for this to kind of see what's performance looking like. The first that I like a lot, I don't know if you can see that, might be kind of small. It's called WordPress Hosting Benchmark Tool. We've got the link there. This is an amazing tool that gives you a quick, easy to understand score for a lot of different areas of server performance. If you go to the next slide, Vic, it shows just a quick screen capture here of something we ran on a managed WP host. You can't see a lot of those numbers, but at the end of the day down there at the bottom, it'll give you a score, kind of show you how does your server stack up against a higher performance option? And you can use this to inform not just where you want to host, but if you're looking at this on a, I ran it when we started, I ran it later down the road, and we're seeing a performance decline. You can talk to your host, you can use that as a conversation point. The specific numbers and what they mean isn't really that important as much as seeing the trend between, like I said, different hosting options could be a really great way to evaluate. And in general, you are going to want to see higher scores on the CPU and memory options here and the database and what they look at on the database side. That's just going to be your best bet for performance inside of a dynamic environment like LearnDash. The other tool we use for server-side benchmarking is WP Performance Tester. And again, I'm talking about tools inside of WordPress. There are a number of things you can look at, run bash scripts and things like that to look at the raw server performance. We're just talking about things that we can, again, like Vic said earlier, the 80-20, we can install these, run them in a couple of minutes and get a result. This one here, WP Performance Tester, it runs some other metrics. What we really look at is the database queries. And here on the top, the Manage WP option you're seeing, we ran this and got a result of 98 queries per second, which is unfortunately just abysmal. We ran it on a member host setup, and we were at least an order of magnitude or more on beyond what we were seeing on the managed WordPress side. And this is just going to result in quicker everything. If you're anything that hits the database, if it's running at 100 queries per second, it's going to be painfully slow. So this is a good way to, again, look at where you're at and see, if you can continue with this host, if you need to have a conversation with them about performance, or if you're happy with where things are at. We would look at, real quick on that one, generally recommend a minimum of around 1,500 or 2,000 queries per second for these dynamic sites that we're running. Anything below 1,000, I would definitely be looking at having a conversation with the web host to figure out what may be going on there. And maybe it's just the nature, again, of being on a cheaper host and they won't be able to do anything about it. But below 1,000 and you'll start to see performance degradation, especially at scale. Okay, looking at the application itself. Again, when we say application, we're talking about WordPress and what's happening behind the scenes with WordPress, what's going on there, what's taking a long time to load as we bootstrap it and spin it all up. My favorite tool here is Code Profiler. There's a pro version, but the free version will at least give you some basic insights. I think the screenshot in the next slide I have shows something that's available even in the free version, where you get to see kind of this chart of what tools are loading and how long are they taking to load throughout the course of a particular request. And this can vary from page to page. So you may need to run the tool on a couple of different pages to see authenticated versus unauthenticated users, back end versus front end, and to really kind of get a picture of what's loading here. But this can really open your eyes sometimes if you have a tool. We see this sometimes with like menu management. Maybe we've installed something to control our backend menus and make it clean up, the WordPress admin experience. And then we find out, wow, when we benchmark this, it's hitting a ton of processor time to do everything it needs to do. Maybe I don't need that, or maybe there's a different way to approach it. Maybe there's an alternative. So this can be really useful information as we dig in. And the slide you got pulled up there now, Vic, shows even down to the individual, and this is a feature of the pro version, but it'll show even down to individual PHP scripts or database queries, read and write operations on the disks, or even remote calls out to other services. If you're reaching out to HubSpot or something of that nature, maybe through WP Fusion, it'll show you all these things logged in a nice interface where you can, again, there's nothing you do from this tool. It's purely for the information to go, oh, hey, that's taking a really long time to load. Maybe that's okay. Maybe that's not something that I even thought would be happening and I need to investigate further. Of course, no conversation on application benchmarking would be complete without talking about New Relic. This is a harder to install. It's very complex and once you get inside of it, but it is very robust. We usually don't recommend it for most folks just because you need root server access to install it. You're going to need a degree in New Relic to probably get in and dig in and really understand what's going on there. But it is kind of one of the gold standards if you really have a massive site that you're trying to really nail down performance on. This will show you lots and lots of details, not just as a one-time snapshot like New Relic does. I'm sorry, like Code Profiler does, but it'll show you the ongoing logs of what this is looking like for the past 30 minutes or 7 days or whatever, however you want to look at and segment the timeframes. You can see how performance was acting as your application was under load from users. Query Monitor is another one that most folks have heard of. We use this for looking at the database queries that are happening from the core WordPress, from the themes, from the plugins, and to see what are they loading. Are they loading anything, duplicates of thousands of queries, or are we having any slow queries that are taking a really long time to run? And so this can just be a way to, again, you're not doing anything, you're optimizing with this, you're just gathering the information to find out what you need to look at next. Load testing is probably the best way to firmly understand how your application is performing. So we can look at all those metrics from the benchmarking and from the server analysis that we just talked about, but load testing is about putting real simulated traffic through your application, through the server, and see how is it going to stack up when we have 10 users at one time, 100 users at one time. Where does it break? When we get to 500 users at one time. And there's a number of tools we can use for this. This screenshot here you're seeing is from loader.io. And we usually, this is a more basic tool, but it's really easy to get started with. It's low cost, and we usually try and at least generate a login event. So we visit the login page, we log in as an authenticated user, and then we visit one or two pages as that authenticated user. And this will give us, again, it's loading that dynamic content now when this is happening. So it gives us a real look at how does our server handle actual users logging in and at least browsing the site. They're not really doing anything in that case. So it's not a true picture, but it can help you understand at a baseline, like, what are we looking at? Again, especially if you're comparing hosting options, it's a great way to see the trend. The other one we have listed here is K6. It's much more complex. There is an open source version, and you can do basically scripting with this. So in the case of LearnDash, we've written tests where we log in as, we have 1,000 dummy users. We log in as one of those users. We go into a course, we step through the course, and we do that for all of those 1,000 users over a 5-minute period or something of that nature. And gives us a look at exactly what's happening when we're doing these things. On the topic of load testing, I'll say there's kind of two things we'll do there. One is, what's our anticipated load that we'd look at? So let's say we might think we're going to have 100 users at any one given time. That's just what I expect from this event that we're about to have. And we might run a test to see, okay, how does it perform with those 100 users? How does it perform with maybe 200 or 300? And then how does it perform if we just throw all the traffic at it that we can? Where does it break? And so again, with that information gathering, we can say, okay, it broke at 800 users. It was great at 100 users. It started to slow down a little bit, but it was serviceable at 200 or 300 users. So we can kind of understand what our factor of safety is there and size our infrastructure appropriately. We don't want to undersize it and run into a problem when we get a load sent to the site, but we don't want to be paying for resources that we don't need either. So this can kind of be a really great tool in our arsenal to help us understand what it's going to look like when real people hit the site. All right, plugin audit. This sounds kind of basic, but it's one of the biggest ways that we can improve performance because what happens when we're building a site, and you've all done this, I've done this too, you get a certain portion of the way through building what your vision is. And then you need to solve the next problem. It's not solved by LearnDash. It's not solved maybe by another plugin you have installed. So what's the first thing we all do? Let's see if there's a plugin in the repository that fixes it. We go, we install that plugin, problem solved, we move on. And then that happens dozens of times throughout the course of building out our application. And suddenly by the end of it, we have 10, 20, 40 plugins that we've installed just for single little fixes here and there. And we were just trying to solve the problem at hand, and we weren't really thinking about the overall application infrastructure and architecture. So we want to start by taking a look at those benchmarking metrics that we had and see what plugins are taking a really long time to load, and especially if they may not have critical functionality. So again, if you installed something for like to embed a snippet for Google Analytics or for Intercom or something of that nature, your chat widget, and it's hitting a long load time for some reason, even if it's not, it's a kind of a single use utility that you really could approach in a different way. You could embed those codes directly into your template, or at least through your some of the options within the theme that are loading anyway to load third-party scripts. And we can maybe get rid of some of those things and maybe find alternatives for ones that are having performance issues from that audit that we ran a little bit ago. The other thing is we run into is we see these massive plugins installed that are only using like a really small subset of the functionality. So that can be another thing to look at as far as an area of improvement. Say, hey, is there a smaller plugin that does this? Is this code that we could possibly hard code into our theme somewhere if we have a developer? Do we need this huge plugin just to do this one little piece? Updating plugins, again, sounds obvious, but there's performance improvements a lot of times that come along in these smaller, these like non-flashy releases. The smaller point releases a lot of times will have performance and security updates that can really make or break some of those metrics that we looked at earlier that can have a huge improvement on them. So I would develop a habit of updating at least monthly, if not weekly, the whole plugin profile to make sure that you're running whatever the latest improvements are. Closely related to that would be using reliable plugins, and maybe even considering most strongly plugins with paid support, because we're going to want to try and stay away from things where it's relatively unknown. Maybe the developer doesn't have a huge incentive to be digging into performance or solving problems that are coming up. So we look for things with lots of install base, good rankings, at least 3 stars, if not 4 or 5 in the repository. If you're looking at free plugins, doesn't mean necessarily that the smaller or less known plugins aren't good. Even Code Profiler is not that well known, but you're just more likely to have a problem with those than you are with the massive, very popular plugins. Again, in general, everything is kind of relatively speaking. And really, I think the biggest takeaway here is to be intentional with the plugin profile. So if you've got things that are installed that aren't really that important, those smaller utility plugins that can be approached a different way, let's look at what can we do to improve our situation, improve the stack that we're running. I don't really believe in limiting yourself to a particular number of plugins. Sometimes you'll see conversations come up. How many is too many? We've seen sites with 4 or 5 plugins that are painfully slow. I've seen sites with 150 plugins that run like there's not a plugin installed at all. So it really just depends on so many things that you can't really look at a particular number and say like, this is too many. Okay, we talked earlier about some types of caching that we're going to deploy, and I want to dig into how we look at those and how we actually optimize those for our site. First is OpCache. And this is usually enabled on hosts. It's really in their best interest to turn this on because it's going to give maximum performance. It's going to reduce overhead on the CPU. Really, the only thing it eats into is the RAM, because we have to store some of this in RAM. But it does require that server-side component. So you would install this plugin, WP OpCache, and you'll see when you turn it on the next slide there, if OpCache is not enabled, you get a warning right here on this screen inside of the plugin, and it says that it can't access it and it's not running. What's more likely is it is running, but especially with the cases of LearnDash and these large plugins, it's probably not configured optimally. And this depends on, again, your host. Smaller, cheaper hosts, you're not going to have much control over this. As you get into more custom environments, this is going to be something you can tweak. And what you want to avoid is the situation I'm seeing here, where I've got these items outlined in red, where we're using up 100% of our memory. Our hit rate, meaning of the files we tried to access, how many of them were being loaded from the OpCache. That's low here. It's running at 60% in this screenshot. We want that number to be as close to 100% as possible. We want the memory number to be below 100%. It doesn't have to be, we don't need it at 10% or 15% or something crazy like that, because that means we're putting a lot of memory to OpCache and not using it. I like 85% as kind of a ballpark. Gives us some room to add files and add plugins and grow a little bit before we hit the memory limit. But we really don't want to be at this case here where we're using 128 of 128 megabytes because we're maxed out. And now anything that's not fitting into that cache, that other 40% that's not being hit by the cache, is being accessed live as the processes, as the requests are being processed. It's just slowing down the page loads. So here on the next slide, we have a better look at something where it's more properly configured. Got 100% hit rate. We're running a little high on the memory usage here. I'd still like to probably bump up our allocation a little bit so we get that number down again closer to 80 or 85%. And the important part being here that our memory is not full and we're pulling everything that we can into it. Okay, Object Cache. This is a look at Query Monitor, and we're looking at no object caching being set up here. And on the far right side, you'll see down at the bottom, there's 171 queries. On the left side, you'll see this page took 0.8 seconds to generate. And when we turn Object Cache on, and this happens through a service that runs on your web server called Redis, you'll see our page load time dropped by 0.2 of a second, but even more dramatically than that, the total number of queries there dropped by a factor of 10 to just down to 17 queries that are running. And so everything else is being pulled out of memory. It's not hitting the database. And that's processor time that you're not eating up. And you see underneath database queries there, it shows 0.2 seconds were consumed at the top, and 0.0038 seconds after we turned on Redis object caching. This was a simple example. I don't remember what page this was on. I think it was on a dashboard. And then all we had installed was LearnDash. There weren't any other tools, utilities. Users were relatively low in that install. So the more your site grows, the more dramatic these differences become as we can kind of keep more of the database queries in memory. And that was literally just by activating the Redis Object Cache plugins. This is the only difference, the only change we made there. Again, that 80/20 was, Redis was already installed, we just activated it. On the server side, you're going to need your host to activate this. It's going to have to be installed, or if you're running a VM or a dedicated server yourself, you're going to have to make sure this is installed and running properly on the server side. On the WordPress side, this is one of those cases where we have the plugin that we install. There's Redis Cache, there's Object Cache Pro, and then if you're using Lightspeed, it has also some object caching built in. Those are going to be the tools that control this. Object Cache Pro is it's by the same people that run the open source. The free version that's in the repository, but you're going to have quite a bit better performance out of that plugin. They've rewritten it in a number of ways to really optimize the performance. More on the database side, some additional things. Scalability Pro, I actually haven't experimented a ton with this inside of our installs, but I have heard some good things from other folks. So I've included it here as something you may want to look into. And then MySQL Tuner. Again, if you have more of that root access to your server where you can make configuration adjustments to MySQL, you can run this Perl script at the command line, and it'll output a number of things you need to look at as far as your parameters for sizes of different caching techniques inside of the database itself, and RAM configurations and things of that nature. So this is going to give you a huge leg up on what would otherwise be kind of a guess or kind of your own manual adjustments that you'd have to make. It doesn't make any of the changes for you, but it will tell you what you need to go through and adjust. All right, Cloudflare. I feel like no conversation, anything on a website would be complete without touching on Cloudflare. Then this is for us is the #1 way to reduce the distance to your users. Again, talking in cases where we have more of a global audience and we don't qualify for that that hyper local audience because they have optimized routing. The hops basically between data centers are optimized better when you step up into Cloudflare than they are with just general DNS services. So, and that the big thing here is, again, we're not talking about the cache. We're not talking about the CDN. All of those things, Core Web Vitals and all that type of stuff will improve if you're improving all these other server-side performance metrics. But our focus here is not any of that. We're just looking at the actual connections between servers and how they get that data to you can be increased with Cloudflare. And of course, you do get a lot of other benefits. We run every site we can through Cloudflare because we get the web application firewall, the DDoS protection. If you're on enterprise, you can have Apex proxying. And so there's a number of benefits. In this case, by running it through that minimally, you're at least taking advantage of some of those optimized paths through the network. Okay, so gotten into a lot of detail here. Where do we go? What do we tackle? That is still, like we said, the 20% of the optimizations that make 80% of the benefit. But what's the first thing to jump into? And my recommendation, again, coming from people deeply ingrained in the hosting space, so take that with a grain of salt. But my recommendation would be to choose the appropriate hosting as the first decision before you worry about any of these optimizations. And I'm not going to say the best hosting or choose a good host, because that's relative, and it's really depends on your particular organization and your audience and where you're at in the growth of your LearnDash site. So choosing something that works for you for the next 6 months or the next year is going to get you off on the right foot, prevent you from having to turn around and remake these hosting decisions right away. But it's also going to prevent you from having to spend too much money too soon before you actually proven out your audience and started to grow your product. So I think with that solid foundation to build on, and hopefully you've chosen a host then that gives you a technical support partner you can depend on, you're going to give yourself the best chance for success as you work to grow your audience and your site. And with that, we'll kick over to, well, I don't know, Risto, have you been monitoring Q&A type stuff? Any questions you see there that we should dig into?
I've gathered some questions, yes, and looks like some of those were answered by Edison. So if it's more regarding LearnDash Cloud and their optimizations. And I have not a question, but something coming from Jennifer. So Jennifer has a lot of gateway timeouts on her website and has a lot of concurrent users. So what's the best way to mitigate that issue?
So, a gateway timeout basically means that we asked for something from the web server and we didn't get it back within the specific time frame that timeout was set for. And so that can boil down to a number of things. Usually it's something either database side. So we're talking about long running queries that aren't executing quickly enough to get that response back fast enough, or we're just chewing through too much PHP code to get that response back before the timeout. So I'd be looking at running definitely some of these analysis tools at the application level and see what plugins are taking the longest to load, and looking at what kind of queries we're seeing. The timeout itself, if your server is overloaded with visitors, meaning, again, let's talk PHP workers. If you've got 2 PHP workers and you're sending through 20 requests a second, and each one of those is taking, let's say half a second to a second to load the page, like you're oversaturating your PHP workers. You could see a timeout in that case where we literally maybe didn't even get a chance to talk to PHP and to do anything because we were just waiting for everybody else's requests to kind of process and get out of the way so that this new one could come in. So overloading the server as far as the number of users can be a cause of it. But there are a lot of cases where it may not matter. We see them. We have super powerful servers. Sometimes we just have a user that tries to load too many users in the back end. Maybe they have admin columns and they're have installed that plugin. They're loading a ton of information about a user, and now they're trying to load 100 users or 1,000 users at a time, times all these different parameters. And we'll see timeouts even with a powerful server if you're just trying to ask for too much information at once. So that's not one that there's like an easy catch-all answer for, but definitely those analysis tools are going to tell you more about where your load time is going as you service those requests.
Okay, and next question would be, with Cloudways, you provision directly from an infra provider. So why is that not the maximum performance you can get?
It depends on the providers that they're offering and the types of virtual machines that they're deploying on there. And even at the higher tiers of AWS, which is probably the most premium option you can run through Cloudflare or through Cloudways, the server processors are just not as powerful as you can get in a standalone dynamic dedicated server. Sorry, Vultr HF is probably going to be the closest you can get there, but there is a limit with how far that can scale as far as the number of processors. So it's a limitation of the cloud providers. It's not necessarily a Cloudways problem in that case. It's just that they're deploying larger servers with relatively slower CPUs in most cases.
Carmen, did you want to I know that you guys, I think, generally run that. So if you want to take over, that's totally cool with us.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. So, sorry, was that all the questions?
Just 2 more, I think.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. If you all want to answer those last 2 questions, that's fine. And then we can pretty much end it here. Yeah, we can go from there.
Okay. You mentioned something about server-side caching, Danny. So what's the deal with server-side caching?
Was there any more detail on that? Are we talking about page caching?
Server-side mostly, just server-side.
I think so. These are one of the questions that can't use server-side caching, like aggressive, like Varnish Cache or these aggressive proprietary caching products on like these dynamic sites, because they conflict with dynamic sites.
Yeah, you cut out quite a bit for there, Vic. So I don't know if you were asking me or clarifying the question or not, but yeah, page caching is what it sounds like that's talking about. And it's just not, you can't, typically when we're doing page caching, we are loading the page. Let's say it's the home page or the contact page or something like that. We're generating that, we're storing that, and we're serving that to every visitor that comes along for a certain period of time. And when we're logging in and the top of the site says Denny, it says my name at the top, welcome, here's your course listing. We can't cache that and show that to the next visitor, because then it's going to be exposing all of my information. It's going to be useless to them. it's going to violate my privacy. And so that just doesn't work. We have to look at ways to cache the data that's coming into those pages and still generate those pages on the fly, but with the cache data and the cache PHP files. And there's some small exceptions to that. With Lightspeed has a way to cache certain pieces of the page, but it generally just doesn't work automatically unless the site and the template and the plugin are configured to work with that technology.
Yeah.
Right. And one more question here. Is the best practice to separate, let's say, the membership domain where the courses are hosted from the sales or marketing domain?
Yeah.
Or should we keep it under one domain?
In most cases, we would recommend separating those just because you're going to have more flexibility than with working inside and around your marketing site without it impacting your membership and your courses and things like that. It definitely depends on your setup and what exactly you're comfortable running. And if you're not doing a ton of marketing, if your marketing site is limited to like a homepage and a sales page or something of that nature, sure, run them all together. But if you're talking about a larger site where you want to be able to just run your membership and focus on that, and then run the marketing site and make changes to it and adjust it and adapt it, I would separate them for that reason. Also, there's going to be a performance impact to different pieces of your marketing site, definitely to the admin side of your marketing site, if you're running these heavier plugins for all the reasons that we've talked about today. So best practice when possible. It's not an absolute, but I would definitely consider it.
Right. Thank you, Danny.
All right, so I think that's all the questions. Thank you all to the MemberFix team for coming and joining us, sharing this information with us. And to everyone joining, the replay email will go out tomorrow around the same time. And I think there's like one more slide with some more information. I'm sorry, I almost forgot about that.
Yeah, so we'll make all of these notes, like all of the links to the different tools we were talking about and the slides themselves, we'll make them available. And if we could do that on the LearnDash page where the replay is going to live, then we'll just make this a redirect. If that's not possible, then we'll just have this as a separate page. And I'll send this to you, Carmen, and you can sort of disseminate it as you please. Okay, perfect. So this link will also be an email that we send out. We'll also try to get it on the replay page as well. So that works. So thank you all for joining us. We'll have another Meet LearnDash webinar coming up next week. And I think the following week we'll have a study hall where we're going to focus on the new gradebook add-on. So if you're interested in using gradebook in your LearnDash courses, I do advise you all to sign up for that webinar. So thank you all for joining, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye now. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.